The 1970s, Italy. A story would begin to pop up into newspapers across the country that, like a lot of mysteries on this iceberg, just doesn't seem believable. Starting with the first account popping up in December 1970, when a man allegedly was attacked by what he described as a 15-foot reptile, like a dinosaur, that radiated heat. The so-called attack happened about 50 miles northwest of Forlì, but this was only the beginning of this next strange cryptid tale, because the most memorable sighting would occur 5 years later in June 1975, when a farmer named Maurizio Tombini reported that a monster appeared in his tomato field near Goro. According to Tombini, it all started when he was working hard in the field and the bushes nearby started shaking, so much so that it spooked him enough to take a step back, and boom, the monster jumped out. He was said to have frightened Tombini, a man known for his seriousness. He later recorded that it had an ugly and unpleasant dangling tongue. It wasn't long after this that someone else would report seeing a giant centipede, suggesting whatever was on the loose had many legs. Tombini, meanwhile, would call the police, who actually took the report seriously. They would telegram senior officers, and before long, officers and soldiers were swarming the area looking for the beast. At first, the story was written off as nothing more than a crocodile that had escaped a zoo, but Tombini insisted he knew what a crocodile was, and this was not one. And it was right around this time that people remembered back to the 1970 sighting. It was this story that would catapult the so-called 1970s dinosaur sightings to the front page. The story was covered just about everywhere in the Italian press, but unfortunately, the details were always incoherent, and the accounts didn't always match up. But according to the vast majority of accounts, the so-called dinosaur was about 10 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, whose legs and feet must have been pretty big because it left these huge lizard-like tracks. Although if we go back 5 years to the 1970 sighting, those were described as looking like T-Rex tracks. And although Tombini's sighting would go down as the most famous, it was far from the only one. As police had received several calls about the dinosaur, many would even state to have heard the dinosaur let out a wolf-like howl, which might fit one description from a witness who said it looked like a reptilian wolf. Other reports stated it was like a giant snake, or upright humanoid-like lizard, or maybe even a giant centipede. And of course the most famous were the accounts that said it looked like a dragon. And although this sounds like an odd story from a very small period of time in Italy, stories like this occurred elsewhere in the early 20th century. Going back to 1939, we have the story of 2 women picking berries in Austin, France, when they claimed to have encountered a huge lizard. This lizard had reported sightings going back to the 1890s. Meanwhile, in South Dakota 1934, a farmer claimed to have seen a 4-legged reptile which was so big it forced him off his tractor before it ran off into a nearby lake. Investigators that came to the site to look over it took it seriously, found tracks near the lake they could not explain. Even stranger was prior to this was an uptick in reports of sheep and small animals disappearing from town. But what was it that people were really seeing? Is the Goro monster of Italy real? Is it really a dinosaur that somehow escaped extinction? Or was it a dragon, or just some unknown animal? Probably neither of these. Obviously, the most likely theory is someone bought a huge reptile that they could no longer take care of and released it into the Italian countryside. What if, because of circumstances beyond your control, a certain group of people began to suspect that you were a god? That's the exact situation a man in World War II named John Frum would find himself in. And the craziest part of this for John is he probably didn't exist. Maybe I should back up some. The mystery starts in the southern Pacific with an island chain called Vanuatu, known then as New Hebrides. And while the exact origin point and history of this religion is unsure, we know it started by at least the late 1930s, but possibly as early as the 1910s. The cult probably started in a movement which was influenced by other local religions on the island chain, and one early story that popped up was a prophecy, that of a man named John Broome who would one day return to these islands, coming from a distant land, and when he arrives, he will sweep the white colonists away and give the islands back to the natives. although some versions of this story claim that one of the local natives, named Manavai, started using the alias John Frum and dressed as a Westerner opposed to dressing as a native, and he went around promising the natives he would bring them luxuries such as homes, clothes, food, and transportation. To make the story even more confusing, some people trace the legend of John Frum to a spirit vision which was brought on by drinking kava, a plant with psychoactive properties. Regardless of the origin, the story basically remains in all the versions. A Westerner, usually a white man, comes to the islands to make the other colonists leave. But for it to happen, the natives had to reject all aspects of Western life, like money, education, Christianity, and of course, refusing to work on plantations for these colonizers. But most importantly, to go back to their culture. And their religion picked up steam, and by 1941, John Frum followers got rid of their money, school, churches, and left the plantations and went back to their old way of life. European authorities at one point would even arrest the man and exile him along with other leaders of the cult. But this is when things would get interesting, because around this time, 100,000 American troops would be stationed on the islands to fight the war with Japan. They brought with them an enormous amount of supplies, obviously called cargo, and is important for a reason we'll come back to in a second. They would also employ 10,000 of the locals to help provide logistical support. This caused an explosion in the John Frum movement, and it became known as a cargo cult, which was a term created in the late 19th century to explain the political and spiritual movements that sometimes popped up in the indigenous Melanesians. But the islanders were impressed by the egalitarianism of the Americans, and obviously with their wealth too. This also led to them conflating perceived benefactors like Uncle Sam, Santa Claus, and John the Baptist into a mythic figure called John Frum, who would empower the island people by giving them cargo wealth, which led to the thought if you prayed to John Frum, Americans would show up bringing cargo of gifts. They even got their symbol from the American Red Cross, as a medical officer flew to the islands and the people thought the plane was associated with John Frum and took the insignia of the cross as their symbol. But after the war, and after the Americans left, the followers of John Frum would begin building symbolic landing strips in an attempt to encourage American airplanes to land once again and bring them cargo. And it's then that some denominations of this religion really started to connect its origin to America specifically, and because of one reason. The movement known as John Frum was, according to this interpretation, from American soldiers introducing themselves to indigenous people by saying, "Hi, I'm John Frum, America." Or sometimes it could even be, "I'm John Frum, England," or "I'm John Frum, wherever." The point being, John Frum was now forever linked to the religion of the same name. By the late 1950s, the movement was growing strong, as now tourists flocked to the region and brought more prosperity to the people. This led to the forming of a non-violent army that was more about the rituals that were created, that would have these followers organize military-style parades wearing US Army-style uniforms with their faces painted in ritual colors and wearing shirts that said TA USA, meaning Tana Army USA, and they would raise an American flag and march with bamboo-styled rifles. The parade takes place on February 15th and is still celebrated to this day, which is the date the followers believe John Frum will return on once again. By the 1970s, it had its own political party, which celebrated its 60th anniversary in 2017. The leader even stated, in 2007, that John Frum, their god, would eventually return. And in no surprise, Europeans over the years have went to the islands claiming to be John Frum, with varied results. As of 2022, there are less than 500 followers left of John Frum, as most of the islands have been converted to Christianity. This is one of the most wholesome mysteries we have covered yet, as this story led to the longest running humanitarian airlift in the world, as Operation Christmas Drop began in 1952 and sees the US Air Force every year dropping off items such as fishing nets, construction materials, powdered milk, canned goods, rice, coolers, clothing, shoes, toys, and school supplies. It also led to one of the best things National Geographic done in the past couple of decades, when they brought men from these islands and took them across the country to show them locations and introduce them to Americans. But I guess the real mystery here, who exactly was the John Frum that originally inspired this belief? It's possible that the most direct link came from a religion that started in the 1930s that was linked to the worship of a god linked to Mount Tucosmera, and then just kind of spiraled from there, and eventually, due to weird coincidences, saw the peoples meeting a John from America, and it kind of mutated from there. Others still believe it can be retraced to prophecies from spirit visions from natives in the 1910s, who claimed a John Broom was coming to save them. While finally, the most likely theory is that John Frum was nothing more than a mixture of several US military figures to visit the island and left good impressions. Christmas is no doubt the most famous holiday in the world, linking several cultures to the religion of Christianity, which was created to celebrate the birth of Jesus, who was born sometime around the winter solstice. And although not as famous around the world as Christmas, Easter is probably just as much an important day, or even more important to Christians, as Christmas. And why is that? Well, if you know even just a little bit about the faith, you will know that Easter celebrates the resurrection of Jesus 3 days after he had been crucified by the Romans. Or was he? That's what brings us to this next obscure conspiracy theory called the Substituion hypothesis, which suggests Jesus was not the man on the cross, and instead, he was an imposter. Now, who this imposter was is up for debate. Some say it was the twin of Jesus, or someone that looked like him and either died in place of Jesus so that he may survive, or that the imposter was the man who pretended to be the resurrected Jesus after the real Jesus died. But where does this theory come from? This can be, in its earliest form, traced back to the Book of Thomas the Contender, or Book of Thomas, which is a Gnostic revelation dialogue. So before we dive into it any further, I should explain for the ones that don't know, like me specifically. Gnosticism was a collection of religious and philosophical beliefs in the 1st century AD, where their main belief is that salvation comes from gnosis, which means knowledge in Greek. And it's a little too complex and deep for me to get into here, but this belief system basically became wrapped up in early Christianity, which brings us back to the Book of Thomas. Now Thomas, you probably know for one specific reason. Yep, the term Doubting Thomas comes from this man, because as the term Doubting Thomas is a skeptic who does not believe anything without direct personal experience, well, according to the Book of John, the Apostle Thomas absolutely refused to believe that Jesus was resurrected and appeared to the other 10 disciples, who, according to the book, seen and touched Jesus' crucifixion wounds. Now let's circle back to the Book of Thomas. It's unknown who actually wrote this book, since it came much later than Thomas and Jesus, probably around the 2nd or 3rd century AD. Regardless, in this book is chronicled a conversation between Jesus and a man named Judas Thomas. And there's some debate on whether this is the same Doubting Thomas we just talked about, or Jude the Apostle, or even Jesus' brother, Jude. But according to this theory, it's Doubting Thomas whom Jesus ends up referring to as him being his twin. That's a long, convoluted way to get back to the origin point of this theory. Then, after this, we have a writing called the Acts of Thomas, not to be confused with the Book of Thomas, that would expand on this, stating that when Jesus was resurrected, he bore an uncanny resemblance to Thomas the Apostle, so much so that another king mistook Thomas for Jesus. But this, and the text from the Book of Thomas, both stop short of straight up saying he was an impostor, but that would come soon enough, in a scripture called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, another Gnostic text from the 3rd century, which will claim that Simon of Cyrene actually took Jesus' place on the cross. But just who was that, you ask? Well, Simon was ordered by the Romans to carry the cross of Jesus while Jesus was being taken to the spot of the crucifixion. And get ready for Sunday school, because Matthew 27:32 is where all this comes from, as it basically makes it sound like the Romans randomly just ran into this dude named Simon and made him carry it. But Simon was actually the father of one of the disciples, Rufus. But according to the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, Jesus would tell the others after the crucifixion, he began to laugh at the Romans' ignorance when they mistakenly began crucifying Simon instead, which Jesus explained that he was only able to pull this off because he was altering his shapes, changing from form to form, which makes it sound like Jesus was a shapeshifter, which I'm kinda surprised isn't a subject on this iceberg. But there's other theories, of course, and just remember, these are not my theories, I'm just relaying it, so don't get mad. But in the Gospel of Barnabas, written over 1,000 years after the events, would make a more interesting claim that Jesus was actually alive when he was lifted to heaven by angels, and Judas was then supernaturally transformed to look identical to Jesus and then went and died on the cross in his place, while some still believe doubting Thomas died on the cross in Jesus' place. Some even take it a step further and suggest that Thomas was in fact Jesus' twin brother, and for whatever reason, it was never disclosed in the Bible. Likewise, there's even a more obscure theory that Jesus had an unknown twin brother that stole Jesus' body and disposed of it elsewhere, and then went on to claim he was the resurrected one. Although, that seems even more unlikely. Islam actually holds a similar belief as well, as a verse in the Quran states they did not kill him nor crucify him. Instead, they only made it appear that way. While there's also a belief in Islam that more than likely the real man on the cross was Judas, although some believe it's possible it was Simon. But as you might imagine, Christians outright dismiss all these claims, and you can't really blame them, as the resurrection is the cornerstone of Christianity, and it's hard to preach the word that Jesus died for you on the cross if someone instead died for him on the cross. Likewise, I find it hard to believe that Simon was actually crucified in his place, just because I have a hard time believing Jesus was belly laughing as he told the story of the Romans mistakenly killing Simon instead of him. It's just too ridiculous. The turn of the century was an interesting time for American newspapers, whom sometimes filled up the spaces of their pages with some of the most fantastical stories. Many times, they were straight up fictional. Sometimes, it was tales of wild men, sea serpents, monstrous snakes, or even ghosts. And it's with that background that our next story emerges, taken from the Idaho Statesman in Boise on March 26, 1905. The story would begin some 20 years earlier in the summer of 1885 in Haley, Idaho. A man named Jardine Henderson, who was out prospecting, would set up camp near the top of a ridge and close to a trail. One evening, when he was setting up his tent, he started to hear the sound of a horse galloping over the nearby trail. Kinda taken aback to hearing what he thought was a horse so far up in the mountains, he turned around just in time to see instead it was some man running down towards him at a speed he believed was superhuman. This man, however, did not notice Jardine and kept on running, and the prospector thought it was odd because this man looked terrified as he kept turning to look behind him as he ran. And it soon got even more bizarre as a cloud of dust raised up behind this man, and it wasn't like this dust was left by him running. Instead, it was like this dust was a living thing chasing him. The prospector was shook up, but didn't know what to make of it, and he eventually laid down for the night. But he thought of it for the following several days, and he eventually made his way to a town called Era, which is now a ghost town in Idaho. It was at this town that he learned from a Judge Waldron that a man had raced in from Haley, Idaho, where the prospector had been, and burst into his place that morning asking for protection. The man allegedly had ran some 70 miles to get there, and he claimed, while in Haley, he looked over his shoulder to see something chasing him. This something was a 40-foot dragon. It all hit Jardine now. This was the man coming running down the trail being pursued by a cloud of dust. And according to Jardine, after hearing the story, unsurprisingly, he never went back to get his camping gear out of fear for this dragon. Now what's really interesting on this one is, according to Jardine's account, he's seen no dragon, and instead, only the cloud of dust pursuing the man, hence the theory that it was a ghost dragon. But what to make of this one? Obviously, there's a huge flaw in this story, and I'm not even talking about the dragon per se. I'm talking about the fact that allegedly the man running from the dragon had to run 70 miles to escape him. That kinda takes the belief right out of it, especially considering this same man was known to quite frequently drink as much whiskey as 3 men, or according to Judge Waldron at least. And speaking of, there's actually no record of Judge Waldron in Idaho from this time period, nor does the name Jardine Henderson pop up anywhere else in that time period. However, one thing to note in this one is that while newspapers routinely published accounts of unexplained phenomena like ghosts and water monsters and the like, dragon articles rarely made the papers, giving it a tiny chance of plausibility. Okay, probably not. Santa Fe, New Mexico is where our next bizarre mystery comes from. At the Loretto Chapel, a former Roman Catholic church now used as a museum and wedding chapel. But what in the world would be so mysterious about it? Well, it's known for its unusual helix-shaped staircase called the Miraculous Staircase, whose construction is mired in legend. The project was commissioned by the Sisters of Loretto in 1873, and at this same time, Archbishop Jean-Baptiste Lamy would bring two French architects, Antoine Mouly and his son, Projectus, to build St. Francis Cathedral, and he suggested that the sisters make use of their services to build the chapel while they were around, and Projectus would be the one to take this job on. And the chapel was completed in 1878, but the staircase was completed by someone else between 1877 and 1881, and just who built it is the mystery. And you might think it's not important, but this staircase is really a work of art. It rises 20 feet while making 2 full turns with no central pole or any support. It's built mostly out of wood and held together by wooden pegs and no glue or nails or any other hardware. Even stranger is the wood used is a certain spruce that is not even native to Mexico, and actually, it's not native to anywhere. That's right, this wood cannot be traced back to any type of tree on this planet. A few years after its construction, handrails were installed as well as an iron bracket for some support, but it's mainly still supported by an inner wood stringer. The construction is by all accounts a marvelous achievement in woodworking, with master carpenters even being confused on exactly how it was built without modern equipment. But let's get back to the construction. The chapel was mostly done before work on the staircase even started, which had to be built because there was no access to the choir loft, probably because the architect died before the project was completed. According to the Sisters of Loretto, whose account was passed down, they would have to contact multiple builders to come in and give an estimate, and each one took a look and basically said there's no way to construct a staircase to the loft because the room had been built way too small and it was way too cramped, so every carpenter turned them down. In response, the nuns would pray for 9 straight days to Saint Joseph, the patron saint of carpenters, and on the last day of the prayers, a mysterious stranger showed up on a donkey carrying tools, offering to build the staircase for them. He then began working alone, using only a few simple hand tools, and then promptly disappeared. He didn't even collect his check, and he would never give them his name. Some versions of this story claim that this all happened in one night, while most stories claim it took him 6 to 8 months to complete. Regardless, the nuns looked at this staircase that was beyond even the work of a master carpenter and stood without any obvious means of support, and they believed it had to be a miracle, and possibly had even been built by Saint Joseph himself. And that's pretty much the mystery to this one, was the man who showed up that night, riding on the donkey, Saint Joseph, the patron saint of carpenters, and Jesus' legal father. Well, before we get to that, it is worth noting that the staircase is in fact supported by stringers like a conventional staircase. Its stringers, however, are just twisted into a helix shape. It's also been pointed out that by using wooden pegs instead of nails, it has kept it from degrading due to compression set as wood swells against the nails due to changes in humidity or temperature. Regardless, it's a remarkable work of carpentry. Now, I'm not going to stray off too much into other possible identities of the builder, since the theory here is Saint Joseph himself built it, but there was at least one man that has been linked to it somewhat over the last couple of decades. In the early 2000s, an amateur historian found a man named Francois Jean Rochat, or as he went by in New Mexico, Frank, who lived in the area around the 1870s. He was an occasional carpenter and reclusive rancher, but it's in an 1895 newspaper describing the murder of this man in 1894 that the paper would cite Frank was the man that had built the handsome staircase at Loretto Chapel. But as we have discussed before, papers in this time period were not very reliable. But there was also an entry in the sisters' logbook showing that they had paid this Frank the equivalent of around $4,700 for wood in 1881, confirming he did do some work for them. Of course, this has been disputed as well, as the memo in the logbook specifically reads, "Paid for wood, Mr. Lashaw, for in school," a reference to a nearby school he built for the sisters. So I ask you, did St. Joseph really show up and build this staircase after all the prayers from the sisters, or was it Frank Roshaw? Around the year 1900, the British Embassy in Paris would be interrupted by the entrance of a young woman who was very distraught. This woman and her mother, apparently on their way home, had stopped at a hotel, but because hotels were booked up almost everywhere that time of the year, the two end up having to book separate single rooms inside the same hotel. Her mother would take room 342, and unfortunately, he would be the last thing she did, as she would lose consciousness right after and landed on the bed. Her daughter was worried like any of us would be and went to go get a hotel doctor. He would go to examine her mother and ran back down to speak to the hotel manager in French before turning back to the young woman and telling her in English her mother was very ill and they had to go get her some medicine, but the ones they needed were on the other side of town. So she jumped into the doctor's carriage and they took off to get it. But what should have been a very quick trip to get and return with the medicine took forever. For some reason, the driver kept the horses at a slow pace and they seemed to just go in circles. And on top of that, when they finally got there and the doctor went in to get the medicine, it took him forever to come back out to the carriage. Finally, after being gone for a few hours, they returned to the hotel and she rushed to the manager to ask how her mother was doing. And the manager blankly stared and said, "I know nothing of your mother. You arrived here alone." By this time, the young lady's frustration was boiling over. But luckily, the doctor walked back in to straighten things out. Except he didn't. He actually was just as confused by her questions as the manager, even though he had just drove her across town. The girl, probably thinking she was losing her mind, rushed over to check at the hotel register to see her mother's signature was no longer there. Instead, a stranger's name was now next to room 342. She refused to believe it though, and demanded to see the room, and the manager finally gave in and took her to see it. And it wasn't even the same room she had left her mother in. Different wallpaper, different curtains, and the luggage was missing. All in all, a crazy story. That's probably not true. Actually, I would say a lot of you have already heard this story before, as it's been collected in various scary storybooks over the century, and it's even been featured on TV shows as well as movies. But how much of it was true? Or is this the 19th century version of creepypasta? And if so, where did it come from? That's the mystery. And the investigation into this might actually surprise you, because as early as the 1920s, journalists were actually trying to trace down the origin of the story. And one writer in particular, for the New Yorker, Alexander Woollcott, would document his pursuit in finding the origin in his articles. And in his last column, he would write that a source at the Chicago Journal told him, the tale began at the Detroit Free Press with a then young man named Carl Harriman. So Woollcott contacted this Harriman, who told him that he sort of remembered publishing the story back around 1898 or 1899, but he was hazy on the details. He wasn't sure if it was a fictional story he created, or if someone told him that story as an anecdote, and then he just expanded on it. Since Woollcott was not getting anywhere with Harriman, he continued his research, and by the 1930s, he finally found what he thought was the first official documentation on the account, in a 1911 news story printed in the London Daily Mail, and he found that it gave the bare minimum parts of the story. Woollcott was now about to mark the mystery closed when a famous Chicago reporter named Richard Henry Little would claim in his article that once again, the whole story had been quickly created on the spot by Mr. Carl Harriman, late one night to just fill a vacant column in the next morning's issue of the Detroit Press. Now, Woollcott, who I'm guessing at this point was getting annoyed with Harriman, would contact him again and ask him point blank, was it true he created the story on the spot that night, or was it possible that he, like a bunch of other people, had just heard the story during his travels? And Harriman again played dumb, and said he couldn't remember. Wolcott now believed that Harriman was just lying to him, because as he reasoned, he found it difficult to believe that someone could craft such a tale like the Vanishing Lady, which by this time had become a well-known story throughout the world, and then just completely forget that he created it. On top of that, the story was never found in any article of the Detroit Free Press. Wolcott would never get his answer, and the mystery of the story would lay by the wayside for the next 80 years, when in 2010, an urban legend researcher, Bonnie Taylor Blake, along with the Quote Investigator website, a fact-check site that traces down widely circulated quotes, would begin their research, and what they found was a bit surprising. They actually found 2 separate tellings of the story in the Detroit Free Press archives, but neither were written by Harriman. Well, maybe not, because come to find out, one of the articles was written by a Kenneth Herford, who penned the article on September 18, 1898, and entitled it as Porch Tales, The Disappearance of Mrs. Neeb. Now what's important here is, information about the writer Kenneth Herford is scarce, but what is available mirrors Harriman's career exactly. Both went to the same school, they showed up at the same newspapers at the same time, they both went to England on behalf of the newspaper at the same time, etc., etc. But Herford disappeared at the same time Harriman got a job as editor, which means Herford was Harriman's pseudonym. Okay, so does that mean Harriman was the source of the story? Actually, no, because as mentioned, there were 2 instances of this article popping up in the Detroit Free Press. The other one appeared about 10 months before Harriman/Herford's article, and this version of the tale is not linked to him or his pseudonym. While the story is a tad different, it follows basically the same premise, except in this version, a police detective is involved and straight up tells the daughter that she died from smallpox, and to protect the city and prevent panic and financial ruin, they had to cover it up and put her mother in an unmarked grave. The story appeared on the same day in at least 3 of the biggest city newspapers in the country, close to a year before Harriman's. In the Philadelphia Inquirer, it took it a step further and claimed that the anonymous writer knew these people personally, and the story did in fact happen. Now all of these different newspapers that covered the story did not cite an author, except for one. The author of the Los Angeles Sunday Times stated that it came from a special contributor, that of Nancy V. McClellan. And just who was she? Well, Nancy had actually lived in Paris for a while and had published several short stories around the time, but most importantly, she worked for the Philadelphia Press in 1897. At the same time, the anonymous writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer claimed to have knew the people in the story personally. And although the story was published in 1897, in many of the tellings, it took place during the 1889 Paris Exposition, and it's very possible that the Americans coming back home from that could have shared the urban legend with McClellan, or it's just as likely she created it all by herself, since she was a fiction writer. Which brings us back to Harriman. Remember when he said that he couldn't remember if he had invented the story, or if it had been told to him as an anecdote that he expanded on? Well, it was the latter, as he did not create the story. The problem is, no one is for sure that Nancy McClellan did either. So I ask you, was it a 19th century version of creepypasta, where we will never know who the real author is, or did Nancy write it? Furthermore, is it possible that it was based on at least some element of truth? I'd love for you to let me know in the comment section below. This next one, I just have to say, God bless those digging through the Wayback Machine to bring us some incredibly weird and bizarre paranormal tales. This next one comes from the now defunct website UFOfreeparanormal.com, which covered all things paranormal and of course took reader emails that shared their own stories. Remarkably, the site debuted in 1994, which makes it a real look back into the past, but this next story actually goes back to 1983. As an email published by the website admin would assert. According to this person, who wished to remain anonymous, he would go on to tell that he lived in an apartment in Hightstown, New Jersey. The sender would tell the story of how he had went to a flea market and purchased an object from a seller who apparently didn't know what it was. but our writer of the email was big into buying black wrought iron objects at the time, and that's exactly what this was, and it was about the size of a small ball. He would tell it had somewhat of a crisscross design with openings that ended at the top with a small ball, and he ended up buying it for 25 cents, even though he didn't know what it was. But he took it home and set it in the center of a corner table near his kitchen, but in the dining room, where it sat for the next week. But that's when the weirdness would begin, because one night, when he went to sleep, he would wake up to see a very bright light shining into his living room through the curtains. Now, our author typically wore glasses, but of course, he could not sleep with them on, so when he rolled over to see what was going on, all he could see was a bursting light of color, kind of like looking at a car's headlights. But this light was very bright, and he had the feeling he better not put on his glasses. Just then, he felt like he was being directed to look over to the table holding the little object that he had bought. He didn't know why, but something was telling him to do it, so he did. And all he could see from the ceiling were colors of gold, silver, red, green, and blue sparkles floating down over this object. He remarked how beautiful it was. After watching for what seemed like seconds, he rolled back over and went to sleep, which I find odd. The next morning, he got up and had no memory of what had happened the night before. He then began to drink his tea and read the paper, and while doing so, he thought, I'll take a quick peek at the little object that I bought, and he was pretty shocked, because the little object had been sliced completely in two, each piece laying on its side. He picked it up to get a closer look, and it appeared as if someone had taken a tool and sliced it in half evenly, just as well as smoothly. He would try to super glue it back together, but it didn't really look right, so he just trashed it. Strangely, he would convey that he tried to tell this story multiple times over the years, but something, or someone, always stopped him. But in 1993, he would attend a local meeting about UFO sightings and finally shared his story. Yet, no one had answers. And as of 1998, when this story was written, there was still no answers. Considering how long it's been, I really hope this individual got some closure. But what about theories? Well, let's go to the obvious ones first. It's very possible that this anonymous author wanted nothing more than to craft a tale that would be published on the website. Second theory, if he was telling the truth, I would have to lean to the thought that he was dreaming, maybe even sleep paralysis. But if we are going to look into the paranormal thoughts, all I can come up with is he bought a cursed item of some kind. Maybe someone can leave a better suggestion in the comment section below. The Cascades are a beautiful and major mountain range that runs from Northern California to British Columbia, Canada, and it's home to the ever-spooky Mount Rainier, a site that is always coming up in those scary disappearance stories. But our next mystery actually takes place in an area called Goblin Creek, where our Redditor, Jack Sprat90, would start us off with a mysterious post. He would begin by talking about how him and his father had spent his early years exploring the mountains, fishing, and hunting. He would also stop to collect a specific type of rock that you could cut in half and polish it to resemble a picture of the view of the mountains from within a cave. He would then take these stones, which he could not remember their true name, and just called them picture rocks, and would take them to a local art gallery / mineral shop that belonged to his dad's friend. The creek where he would get these rocks wasn't extremely long, but he rarely seen people out there. Actually, it had only happened twice. Once was a game warden, and the second time was where our mystery comes in. When he was about 14 years old, he remembered hauling a bag full of those picture rocks back to his dad's truck, and along the way, he passed a man about 30 years old. He would remark both of them seemed surprised to have ran into one another in such a remote location. As he got closer to this man, the stranger would get more and more nervous, almost as if he had seen a ghost, but they passed each other without saying anything, although the man did stare at him like he was trying to figure out what to say. As Jack Sprat90 made his way back to his dad's truck, he could not get over just how much this guy looked like someone in his family. He just couldn't place who. He would then dump the rocks off to the truck and go back down to the creek to link up with his dad and tell him, but his dad had not seen the man, and that was it for a while. and the boy grew up remembering this weird occasion. He actually remembered it vividly, but it would be when he came back as an adult to visit his parents that our story continues. After hanging out with them for a while, he got the urge to go visit Goblin Creek for nostalgic purposes, as it had been 15 years since he had been up in those mountains. On his way there, he parked where his dad used to park and began walking through the woods to the creek. But on his way in, he saw something that stunned him. There was a boy, about 14 years old, wearing a backpack that looked to be burdened by some heavy weight. When he got closer, he got even more confused, because this boy looked exactly like he did at that age. He was going to say something to him when he passed, but he could not come up with the words, and the boy kept walking. So Jack Sprat 90 continued to walk as well, and that's when it hit him. That boy was himself 15 years ago, and he had just experienced the other side of a time loop. He quickly ran back to try and find the boy, but he was gone. But he remembered he should go check the creek where his father had been those 15 years ago, and where he himself had went. But when he got there, no one was there. He even walked down the creek some, searching, and found nothing. He would end up going home and told no one of the experience because he didn't think they would believe him. A crazy story, and the theories are just as crazy. Of course, you get your typical glitch in the matrix, but there's also the thought of it being time travel. But the big one is closed time-like curve, which is a concept in general relativity that describes a situation where an object in space-time can return back to its own past. Basically, it's a path through the fabric of space-time that loops back on itself. Of course, it's all theoretical, and the answer to what really happened to Jack Sprat 90 will probably never be known. Crewe, Virginia, May or June of 1968. A man who only disclosed his first name as Bob would recount a very interesting story. It all began when he was a young child in the rural area of Virginia when his mother began giving birth. His dad would send him along with his brother out to the front porch to wash their hands. Remember, this is rural Virginia in the 1960s. It's then, at this very critical juncture, that Bob would spot something that scared him to death. While washing his hands, he saw a childlike creature step up onto the porch. He was terrified and quickly turned to his brother, who was also on the porch, but he apparently had not seen it. Bob would try to speak to tell him what he had seen, but it was like he couldn't talk, like this creature was stopping him from it somehow. He would go on to describe this being as having pinkish red skin, big shiny eyes, and a mouth. He could not recall seeing a nose since it was so small, but he did remember it having small-like hooves, which led him to calling it a devil. It also moved insanely fast, which is why his brother must not have spotted it. Bob would not say anything about this for years, and only told his father shortly before he died, about a decade later, although his father did not believe him. This report originally came in to author/paranormal researcher M.J. Wayland, who has published several articles and books and documented hundreds of paranormal incidents over the years. And after receiving this report, MJ would begin researching more into the so-called Red Devil sightings of Virginia. He soon came across a now-defunct website called The Spheres of Influence, edited by a Chris C., who launched the website after witnessing the Red Devil himself. One of these incidents came in 1992, when a witness going by CM wrote that after high school, this young man and a friend visited a local trail around 4:30 p.m. when they spotted a devil around 2 to 3 foot tall, covered in red fur. He let out a piercing laugh, which caused the two to freak out and take off running. The devil chased his friend for about 10 to 20 feet before returning back to the woods, laughing all the way. A month later, a JP came forward and reported while driving Red Hills Road through Horntown, he stopped to turn around and ended up backing up this little side road. All of a sudden, his truck made a sound that we never want to hear, the scraping of something underneath the vehicle on the road. He opened the truck door, jumped out, and was going to look underneath to see what was damaged. But all of a sudden, he instead heard a noise in the bushes, one that spooked him enough that he jumped back into his truck, thinking he was about to be attacked by a wild animal. He then turned to look out the back window, and the devil slowly stepped out of the bushes, first revealing his hands, and then a large grin. JP said he was about 3 to 4 foot tall and looked like a satyr, which is a creature from Greek mythology that is half human, half goat, and is usually depicted as having a permanent erection. Thankfully, JP never disclosed if he's seen that erection or not, but he did describe it having red hair all over its body and legs of an animal, hooves like a horse or goat. And of course, this caused him to put the truck in gear and drive off quickly. But it doesn't stop there, because just 3 years later, in 1995, a husband and wife parked in an area called Red Hills, claimed they spotted the little being staring into their vehicle, and as soon as they noticed him, it took off into the woods. The sighting stopped again for 2 years until April 1997, when a JS was on a back road and saw a little thing that looked like a white dog until it stood up on 2 legs and walked off into the woods. Then, 2 months after that, in Chincoteague, a person known only as BCM spotted a being 3 foot tall with a pudgy stomach with white fur. Its legs were very angled, and its head was pointed with deep eyes that seemed dark, which led to its face blending in with its fur. It had thin arms with hands that had claws. It stood there a few seconds until the startled witness jumped back, causing the thing to gallop off on its legs. So going by all that, the creature was originally reported as red, and then white about 3 decades later, indicating that it probably aged, although, curiously, other sightings in that time period were also described as red. But what's really interesting is its other features: the height, the covered in fur, the hooved feet, and the laugh. All that has remained consistent in every sighting over the decades. But what in the world is it? Interestingly, some have attempted to trace it to legends from local indigenous peoples, particularly that of the Maliseet Nation of New Brunswick, who tell of magical little beings who appear at certain times and places in the Native American community. They are said to represent an omen, good or bad, but they are more known for playing pranks and tricks on people, usually in the middle of the night, by thumping the side of your camp or canoe, braiding horse manes, tying your clothes to a clothesline, or throwing stones in the lake while you're fishing. Of course, these are just Native American legends, but they kinda mirror some European ones, like the satyr we mentioned previously. Others try to connect him to a Native American version of Spring-Heeled Jack. Of course, it's also very possible that people are just misidentifying normal wildlife. Alright guys, you know what time it is. It's the Mystery Roundup segment, where we take the smaller, less interesting mysteries, or the ones without much info available, and combine them into one little section. So let's begin with Corbin Bleu, Wikipedia translator. Corbin Bleu is an American actor and singer who came to prominence in the late 2000s for his role as Chad Danforth in the High School Musical trilogy. But the mystery revolves around his Wikipedia page that, for some reason, has been translated into 212 languages, making his page the 3rd most translated in Wikipedia history. Even more impressive, it has even been translated to Old English and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. But why do this? That's the mystery. The IP behind the user doing it is in Saudi Arabia, and the only theory for why he's doing it is because he's a superfan, although I guess he could be trolling too. The caramel creature refers to a cryptid that was spotted on December 12, 2014 in Carmel, Indiana, when Ron McGlone of the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, would get a report from a witness driving in Carmel when he came up over a hill and saw a 7-foot tall gray slim creature with muscular legs that walked like its knees were backwards and had no arms and no jawline. The witness was a 60-year-old former Marine whose wife said that he was a skeptic and would have never admitted it happened if he had not been in shock. He would even create a sketch when he got home. The reason I didn't cover this one more is that's pretty much it. That's the only thing we got. The only theories are that it was a cryptid sorta like the Fresno Nightcrawler, although some wildlife experts in the Carmel area state that it was probably just a deer walking on its back legs. The Eternal Flame of New York is a small natural gas flame located within the Eternal Flame Falls, a waterfall in Chestnut Ridge Park near Orchard Park, New York. It is unique because it burns continuously behind the waterfall, fueled by natural methane gas seeping up from the cracks in the rocks. You can see it any time by going to the park, and on the few times that it is extinguished, hikers or passerbys usually relight it. It's pretty cool, but not really a mystery. The Penarth Big Cat / Pterodactyl 2005 is another cryptid sighting from Penarth, Wales, from a woman sitting in her garden and looked up to see an unknown creature spread out across the top of the wall. The woman walked closer to get a better look, and the animal jumped up and went over into her neighbor's garden. She said it was several feet long, and that it nearly scared her to death. And I know that don't sound like much of a mystery, but it's actually what happened a couple of days prior that makes it one. Because just days before this, in the same area, there was another reported cryptid sighting that made the local news, except that time, it was supposed to be a cat, while this woman was adamant that it was a bird-type creature, which leads to the reason of why this one is even known here. It's because many cryptid sightings that end up in the same area oftentimes begin to overlap each other as far as descriptions go, such as seeing Bigfoot, or a big cat, or a bird, or even a dinosaur, which leads to the thought that some cryptids look similar to multiple other cryptids, while sometimes, like in this case, it's possible that the cat seen before transformed into the bird that the other lady seen, or at least that's what the theory states. The To Catch a Predator Craigslist Warner is a theory about the TV show To Catch a Predator, which was a show that ran from 2004 to 2007, and I probably don't have to tell you the show's premise, but for the few of you that don't know, Chris Hansen, along with Perverted Justice and Law Enforcement, busted predators. They would begin by chatting with them online and then lure them into meeting where law enforcement was waiting, but not before Chris Hansen would interview and embarrass them. But this mystery revolves around the time they set up to do a bust in Long Beach, because during that sting, a warning got posted to Craigslist advising that Dateline was in the area filming an episode, so for the other pervs not to fall for anything. This also happened at least one other time during a sting in Ohio. The theory is, who was the warner? Some people have suggested that maybe someone on the crew let something slip to someone they trusted, and then that person set out to do the warning. Others have wondered if there was a rogue agent working for Perverted Justice, but the most likely theory is it was some predator who recognized the signs during the chat and then went online to warn all the other local perverts. The Robert Downey Jr. whistleblower mystery was this theory that a whistleblower working from Hollywood who was working to expose abuse and trafficking going on by documenting it anonymously online was actually Robert Downey Jr. And honestly, I can't find why people think that, other than they like him as an actor. Regardless, he never confirmed it, or even acknowledged it, and then the story faded away just as quick as it first appeared. The Lion Man Encounters comes from the subreddit known as Humanoid Encounters, where Redditor J4BB3RW0CKY would tell the story of being 5 to 6 years old when his dad pulled up into a church parking lot to drop something off at the kitchen. He would note the back of the church was a large field surrounded by trees, when all of a sudden, 2 people in lion costumes suddenly appeared and began dancing around the car. These lions were aggressive but didn't try to get in. They instead continued to dance, which caused the car to rock slightly from being pushed by the lions. The Redditor would go on to say that he was scared and hid his face. When he looked up, the lions had disappeared. Years later, he would ask his dad about it, who vaguely remembered the event but thought it was a dream. He later speculated that it may have been the mischievous twin sons of his pastor. The pastor's twins were known to be troublemakers who lived next to the church. This took place sometime in the early 1990s, but he stated he still was not sure what happened that day. Although, I do think his theory about the twins being responsible is probably accurate. Alright guys, that does it for the roundup. Let's get back to the video. (2011) In the small town of Verkhoyansk, Russia, located deep within Siberia, where the climate is one of the coldest in the world, which is because it's in the Arctic Circle. And because of those reasons, it's sparsely populated, supporting around 1,300 people, which makes this next wildlife mystery even more scary, because it would be early that year in February that a so-called superpack of wolves were releasing chaos on the small village. Within 4 days, this superpack of wolves killed more than 30 horses, but that wasn't all they killed. They killed numerous other livestock as well. And you may think, well, that's part of living so close to the wild. But here's the thing, wolf packs usually number around 6 to 7, sometimes up to 12, and the largest wolf packs, although rare, can get up to 30 or so. But this wolf pack contained 400 wolves. Actually, it's not even really fair to call it a wolf pack. It was more like a confederation of wolf packs working together, which encompassed 400 wolves, which is just insane and dangerous as you think. And it left animal experts completely baffled, as this is not something ever seen before with wolves. The situation was bad enough that 24 teams of hunters were sent in to try and bring the population down. But what actually caused it? That is probably pretty easy to guess. According to wildlife experts, this most likely happened due to the extreme temperature drop, which had reached -56 Fahrenheit, and in turn killed off their usual prey, such as rabbits, because of the lack of food. This led to bigger packs working together to kill horses, something they would basically never attack in a smaller group. Citizens did take their own actions in addition to the hunters. They would set snares that caught some of the wolves, but didn't really slow them down. But is any of this true? After looking into the claims more, biologists and other wildlife experts begin to doubt the claims. First of all, it has to be said that Russia's media is not reputable, but what really makes it even more dubious is killing around 30 horses probably would not be enough to even feed 400 wolves. There's also the fact that the reporting kinda seemed to be all over the place. In addition to the 30 horses claimed killed, some sources stated they also killed 6 children, while no names were ever given, and other sources don't mention children at all. 2 years later, the stories popped up again, this time claiming that 300 horses and 16,000 deer were killed in 1 year, which seems like way more food than they would need. That's nearly 1 horse plus 44 deer a day, which is hard to believe. The claims even go further back though, with stories of wolf packs attacking a wedding party consisting of 120 people, and only 2 of those people survived. And although it was a widely circulated story, it was almost certainly false, because this story that was told as a fact in 1910 can actually be traced back to 1880 when Russian immigrants told the same story to Americans. The superpack wolf stories are largely now viewed as nothing more than fake news. And it doesn't help that the stories are usually circulated in tabloids that are not very reputable. And it also has to be pointed out, in spite of the 400 wolves roaming the countryside, not one picture was ever taken. That brings us to the end of part 9 of the obscure unsolved mystery Iceberg Explained. We are now about 3/4 of the way through layer 3. I hope you all enjoyed. Goodbye and good night.